Public Interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thanks for joining us again for another informative week. On this week's program, we focus on the labor movement in Guyana. Now, a partnership for national unity and David Granger are more or less accusing the PPPC, of course, as the current government of dividing our trade union movement. With me, as always, is leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Mr. David Granger, to discuss this topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Malika.
Great to have you. Mr. Granger, APNU's call for the PPPC to desist from dividing the trade union movement in Guyana seems to have come at an opportune time, and I'm saying this because we saw recently in the news two unions, that's the GAWU, which is of course the PPPC's union, people describe it as that, and the GPSU, more or less complaining about unsatisfactory, if you want to say, happenings in their unions, and not only in their unions, regarding workers. How connected is your call to those two events?
Well, the two unions are as different as chalk from cheese. The Guyana Agricultural and General Workers Union is essentially a PPP union. It always has been. There's no pretense about that. The actual president of the union is a member of the People's Progressive Party in the National Assembly, Mr. Kovan Chan. And the union is based largely in the sugar industry. It has branches in other industries, but mainly they represent sugar workers. And there was a wildcat strike early this week, and many of the workers, I think from East Kanji, came out to picket, and of course they headed straight to the PPP office in New Amsterdam. So that was very significant because being members of the union, they know that the union is political, and if they want to have their problems resolved, if they want solutions to the issues, they would have to seek political solutions. They didn't picket Gaisuko office, they picketed the PPP office. In the second instance, the Guyana Public Service Union, which represents thousands of public servants, including nurses, including workers, contract workers in hospitals, and in the public sector generally. It is the largest public sector union, served an ultimatum on the central government, calling on the government to start talks, start negotiations. Now, the two issues are quite separate, as I said, but it means that something is happening in the labor organization. Something is happening in the trade union, something is happening among workers, and the government does not seem to be on top of it. That is my feeling, that two incidents may not be connected, but they're connected in the sense that, taken as a whole, I don't think the PPP is managing its labor relations very well.
PPP officials may say that you can't necessarily, you shouldn't accuse them of trying to divide the labor movement. What are some of the probably strong evidence to prove that the PPPC has worked toward dividing the trade union movement?
Well, there have always been differences in the movement itself. It has never been a solid block. There were times, I think a very long time ago, when there was one TUC. I would reckon the TUC about 60 years old. I believe the present incarnation of the TUC, if I can call it that, was in October 1953. So in fact last month would have made it 60 years old. But there have always been different factions. At present, we see that as a result, in my mind, as a direct consequence of two major events under President Jagdio's regime, a deliberate plan has been concocted to split the union. In the first instance, there was a strike on Mrs. Janet Jagan in 1999, and it was an 8-week strike, and it was very damaging. And most of the public service was shut down for about 8 weeks. And as a result of that, something called the Armstrong Tribunal was convened, and the public servants got what they would call a massive increase. Instead of the usual spoonful that you were getting from the government. But it started to make sense to the public servant, because before that time they used to be called the employed poor. The salaries were very low. So that strike was meant to bring about the change. It did bring about the change, and it was successful. The second big strike occurred 4 years later in 2003, I think it was. The teachers struck for about 5 weeks. And as a result of that strike, the government was forced to re-engage the teacher union, the GTU. And in fact, the teachers themselves got a large pay increase, and some of the other benefits were improved or enhanced. The point is that those two strikes took place within the public sector. Okay. And these were two important branches of the public service which are needed to make government work. And because of the sensitivity of the public servants and their role in the state, I do believe that that was used as an excuse by the PPP to try to weaken the unions, break up the labor movement, to prevent it happening again. They did not seem to understand that the very success of the strike made teaching more efficient, or made the public service more efficient. They felt that success by the workers meant defeat by the government. I don't see it like that at all. I think that the teaching profession was able to enter a new phase of relations, and I think that type of strike is unlikely now.
I'm happy that you did say that type of strike is unlikely now, because after giving that little history about previous strike actions, how damaging would a possible, because the GPS did threaten to encourage the workers to take strike action now, how damaging would a possible strike action be at this point in time by our public servants?
Let me turn the question around, if I might.
Sure.
I feel that what needs to be examined is how damaging the present conditions of work are on the public service. I feel the public service is demoralized. I think that most public servants want to work. They work very hard. I've been in the National Assembly. I've seen the support that public servants give to their ministers, particularly during the time of the budget. And I think they're poorly paid. Sometimes they work in very poor conditions, office space and so on. Although there's a large number of public servants, they are very poorly paid. Sometimes they operate with very poor equipment, difficult circumstances. The question is, when people ask for improved salaries, improved working conditions, these are meant to improve the quality of their work, the effectiveness of their work. And when it does not happen, there is a possibility that the continuation of poor conditions would result in poor work. So to answer your question in a roundabout fashion, I would say that it is likely to do greater damage not to listen, not to have a good relationship with the workers, than to allow a bad situation to go on. We need to work out a new, what I call a social contract with the workers, particularly in the public sector, and that will prevent greater damage, in my view.
I know you can't read the Finance Minister, Dr. Ashley Singh's mind, but can you somehow say why has government not honored the increased payments to these workers? Is there any way that you could shed some light on that?
Well, it's not always a question of honoring, because in some cases there is no agreement. The government has resorted to a tactic or technique every year, and it's now November, and read my lips, by this time in December, the government will announce a unilateral pay increase to public servants. But over the years, it has been discovered that the pay increase is minimal. That is, it barely covers the rate of inflation, so that public servants more or less end up the same place they were in December 2012 or 2011. There's no improvement.
Okay.
The government, I do not recall, has ever sat down, or within recent years, sat down with the GPSU to negotiate conditions of service or conditions of pay. And this is what you call something called a collective labor agreement, CLA, and there should be collective bargaining, in which the two sides would sit down and discuss how not only wages and salaries, but also other conditions of work could be improved. For example, in the public service, the rates of meal allowances and travel may not have been reviewed or increased for several years. So these things need to be looked at periodically. The government has not been doing that. The government has been making arbitrary and unilateral payments, which the public service always refers to as inadequate. So to come back to the question, the finance minister and I think most of the PPP executive are living in a dream world. They feel they can continue handing out crumbs to the public servants. They may feel they're saving money, but what is happening is that they're losing productivity.
The head of the GPSU mentioned a 25% increase. At any time during talks or negotiations with the PPP regarding the budget, I mean with yourself and probably the president or your team and the PPPC's team, did that 25% increase ever come up? And if it did come up, how detailed did you go into the discussion?
A partnership for national unity is not a bargaining agent for the public servants. And we respect the right of the GPSU to bargain on behalf of its members, and we don't seek to take their place, the union's place. We did point out to the president, we did point out during the budget debate that there needs to be an increase. And we had proposed a floor, without prejudice to what the union was calling for, a floor increase of 10%, which is much more than the government would tend to pay. It normally pays something in the vicinity of 5%. So I would say that 25% is reasonable. It is a figure that I would support. But I would not put myself in the place of the union and say whether it's 25, 26 or 27% because I don't know. The union would have calculated what they call a basket of goods which a household would require. A normal household, mother, father, children, to survive or to live comfortably. And based on its own calculations, it has its own advisors, the union would have made such demand. I don't know the grounds of the demand, but in my view, I would say that 25% is quite reasonable.
What role should the Ministry of Labour play in all of this, if they're playing any role at all?
Well, the Ministry of Labour is the part of the executive which interfaces with the union. And it is the Ministry of Labour which should conduct negotiations with the union. And the Minister of Labour should take the recommendations to the Cabinet for approval so that it could be incorporated in the budget. That is how I feel the system should work. When you had the work stoppage or the strike of 1999, it was so serious that a commission under Mr. Aubrey Armstrong, I think there were 2 or 3 other persons, Mr. Bobin Granger and I think Professor Clive Thomas, but it was chaired by Aubrey Armstrong. A commission investigated the actual wages and conditions of work of the public servants, and based on their analysis and conclusions, a recommendation was made. So I would say that a similar exercise needs to be done periodically. It's not a once-for-all thing, but given the fact that expenses increase, cost of living increases, it is likely that most tribunals which investigate workers' salaries, particularly in a country like Guyana, would recommend increases. And it's my view that the government is reluctant to pay their working people better, particularly those in the public sector, public servants, nurses, teachers, and so on. And that is one of the reasons why they continue not to negotiate, but to hand out, these small amounts once a year.
Opposition leader, early in 2013, you described the 2013 budget as a cardboard budget painted to look like concrete. Would you say that all of these issues that are coming up now regarding public servants and the trade union, are they things that vindicate what you had said about the budget then?
The budget is not a serious development tool. The budget is not a matter of balancing figures, so much income, so much expenditure. The budget must be used as a tool for developing the country, helping to increase productivity, so that we don't have idle factors, idle land, idle labor, or idle capital. My view was that the budget was not, at the time it was brought before us, an instrument for that sort of development. And as a result of that, we have a situation in which labor, particularly as a factor of production, is not, particularly labor in the public sector, is not sufficiently recompensed. The result is that people are demoralized. They don't work very hard because they don't feel the reward is worth the effort. And this is what the Minister of Finance didn't seem to understand. If you pay people peanuts, you're going to get poor quality of work. And in APNU, we feel that workers should be given the incentive. They're paid more to do more. And they're given better conditions of work. They're given better salaries. And we'd have a more efficient public service. There is no point complaining about police corruption, public service corruption. Part of the problem of corruption is that people are badly paid. So you don't need a bloated public service. You need an efficient public service, a well-paid public service. And this is what I've been saying for many of the branches of the public sector. Make sure that people are well-educated, well-trained. Make sure they're well-remunerated. And if you don't do those things,